Revelation. Give everybody another moment here, and then we'll get started. All right. What prayer requests would we like to include this morning? Yes, Henry.
I want to remember the family of Michael Stanley.
The family of Michael Stanley.
It's a man and his wife, 4 kids, and a dog. They didn't have no place to live, so we put them up. Our church put them up last night. Brought them over here, got them lunch food out of the food pantry. So we were able to help them. We need to remember them that they can get their act together.
Okay. So praying for the family of Michael Stanley. Kind of transient right now. Okay. Yes, Sandy?
We have a new baby boy. It's Wanda's Gregory. And 6 pounds, 9 ounces.
Maverick William.
Southeast.
Okay. Congratulations to the Norris family and a new baby born, Maverick. Yes, Jesse?
Jay Mitchell, he owns Mitchell's Garage here in town.
I heard about that last night.
Yeah, he aspirated, like while he was sleeping, Friday. He was an hour without oxygen to his brain, so he's hooked up to everything, all the machines. They saw minimal brain activity Friday night, so they're just kind of holding out hope, but it's not.
What's he about? 45, 50, somewhere in that range?
Same age as Sid.
Okay.
48.
48. Okay. So Jay Mitchell, a local mechanic here, aspirated in the night and was without oxygen for about an hour, and they're not sure yet if he's going to pull through. Not a whole lot of signs of activity with the brain. So, got a young family. Yes, Frank.
We need to pray for Henry. He has lots of problems with his hip, and this Friday and Monday he's having some examinations. So we want a good outcome for him.
Yeah, Henry's got some upcoming tests and procedures. Okay. Yes, Robbie.
I've got a lot of medical problems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out what they are.
Okay. Robbie said he's got some medical issues. He's not sure what they are. Would like us to pray for him. Anything else this morning? Of course, some of our folks are in Georgetown this morning, and this is our E-Squared Youth Rally Weekend, co-hosted with the Two Timbers Church. So a few of our folks are not here today. Some of our folks are. So if it looks a little different today, that's why. But we got some guests with us too, and we're glad you're here. All right. Any other prayer requests today? All right. Russ Rogers is going to lead us.
Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful and so thankful for the privilege of assembling this morning in this Bible class. We pray for Clay as he leads us, and we also pray for the other teachers this morning who are teaching other ages. We're grateful for your word and thankful that we can study it this morning together. We're grateful for the beauty of another day and for rest, and we're just thankful for the rain we're receiving, thankful for warmer temperatures, baby boy that the Norrises have in their family. We're thankful for the health of that baby, and we pray that you'll be with the parents and bless them in the upcoming days with that special new boy. We understand a local young man, Jay Mitchell, is in serious condition, struggling for his life, and we pray that you'll be with his family, be with the doctors. We pray for that situation, Father, if it be your will, if he can recover from that. We're grateful and thankful for you watching over that situation. We'd like, Father, you be with Henry Norris in his upcoming test this week and procedures to determine some things that could be done to improve his pain and mobility and his situation overall with his health. We ask your blessings to be with Henry and give him the patience, and we pray that those tests can be positive and they can come up with some things that will be effective. Father, we pray for Robbie this morning, dealing with issues that kind of undetermined, but we pray, Father, that you'll help him and the doctors that are helping him understand those things. We pray that they can come to some good results and he can have some favorable improvement in those situations. We're grateful, Father, for the weekend youth rally that was able to take place yesterday here and now today at the Two Timbers congregation. We pray, Father, that a good day can be had there. The speaker will be able to deliver lessons that will be encouraging to all those who are able to be there. We pray, Father, that you'll be with us in this hour, be with us in our worship hour. We pray that all things will be done to bring you all the glory, and that you'll forgive us when we fall short in our daily walk. And bless us now as we study together. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, if you want to open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 6, we'll be in Revelation chapter 6 and 7, and the first part of chapter 8 this morning. Revelation beginning in chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6. And we'll do a little bit of review for a moment before we begin looking at these verses in particular. So there's one thing we're going to take home. I know we're going to take this home from this quarter if we get nothing else. What is the book of Revelation about? Everybody say it. Jesus. There you go. All right. It's not about cosmic visions. There are those. It's not about warfare. There is that. It's not about all these other things that we may see. It's about Jesus. And if we can keep that focus, we can avoid a lot of the noise that surrounds this book. We looked last week at these details. I've been alternating back and forth. We spent some time reviewing over the last few weeks the ways that people read the book of Revelation, but today and last week we've talked about these important details of the book. So who is the author? John the apostle, who's called the Beloved. He's the author of the Gospel of John. He is author of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the letters that we have near the end of our New Testament. And so he's one of the primary authors of the New Testament. Luke, John, and Paul account for, I don't know the exact number, probably 90% or more of the New Testament. All right. To whom is this book written originally? I gave you help, didn't I? All right. There are locations there on the screen. This is the outer portion, if you will, of the Roman Empire in the first century. So you look at the reach of Alexander the Great, and then the Romans building on that. And these folks are in Asia Minor, so there is an Eastern influence in their culture, but they are still under the oversight, if you will, of the Romans. Okay? What did we say were the key themes of the book? Victory and hope. Victory and hope. And that victory and hope comes through Jesus, right? And the image that appears primarily in the book of Revelation of Jesus is the lamb-like slain. He appears as a lion and then as a lamb as though slain to represent his sacrifice and his resurrection. And it is through that sacrifice and his resurrection that we have victory, the sacrifice, and the resurrection, hope. Victory and hope through Jesus, the lamb-like slain. And then we said the context of this. You look at those letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, and you find that all of these churches are dealing with one or both of these problems. Either they're being persecuted for their faith, or their culture around them is tempting them into sin, and sometimes those two things are intertwined, aren't they? And so this book is written for them to encourage them in this setting. That doesn't mean we can't get anything from it. That doesn't mean that we should read it as though it only matters for them. But we do need to understand how it mattered for them in order to make application to our lives. All right? So now we're in chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 5. And I'll ask you a question. You know, I've done a lot of lecture in the front part of this class because I want us, as I've said, to build a toolbox so that when you get done with this class at the end of the quarter, you have a level of comfort reading the book of Revelation. Nobody understands all of Revelation. Anybody who claims to understand all of it, you probably don't need to listen to them, okay? But there are portions of it in great grand swaths, if you will, painting with broad strokes that we can understand. And my goal, in part, in this class is to give you tools that you can use to understand the big picture ideas of the book. So I want to ask you a question now. We've read the first 5 chapters. Has it been as intimidating as you would think? Has it seemed really bizarre and hard to understand so far? I see some saying no. It's okay to say yes.
Yeah, I was about to say, I can't claim that I've understood everything I've read.
Sure, okay. Well, the hard part starts today, and that's why I asked that. If you felt good about it, I'm not deflating you. I'm not saying you shouldn't have felt good about it, but it is going to get harder. And in fact, when we get right here to this section, and from here on, the matters that people disagree, you know, we talked about those various interpretations. The matters that people disagree about in Revelation are going to multiply significantly from this point in the book forward. And we're going to look not at all of those today because, as I've said to you as well in this class, my goal is not to answer every possible interpretation, but to look at big picture ideas. But we'll hit on a couple of the key interpretive sticky wickets or whatever you want to call them this morning. But to do that first, I want us to get a big picture idea of this section. So there are 3 cycles that we mentioned last week in our study of the book of Revelation. 3 cycles of 7. And some interpreters say that these 3 cycles represent the same series of events, and others say that they are progressive. That is, the first cycle that we're looking at this morning is a period of history, and then after that is this second cycle at some point, and then after that is this third cycle at some point. I hope that over the course of this class we can address some of that, but we're not going to necessarily talk about that today while we talk about the first cycle, the 7 seals. So if you had the opportunity to do the Bible reading before class today, you know that we left off at the end of class last week. John is seeing this vision in heaven, and there is God on the throne, and he has this scroll with 7 seals, and the declaration is made in heaven, who is worthy to open the scroll, and the lamb-like slain appears, and he takes the scroll, and what happens when we get to chapter 6 is he begins to open the seals on the scroll. Now when you hear the word seal, you're thinking about like what you might see even today, a wax seal on an envelope. Typically, if a scroll is sealed, that means that it has important information in it. So if a messenger is carrying a scroll, it is sealed because it is from someone important to someone important, and it contains something important. Well, this scroll has 7 seals. You think that's important? We talked about numbers last week, and we said 7 means what? Does anybody remember? Complete or perfect. And we also said that it is the combination of 2 numbers, 3, which represents what? God or deity or the divine. You know, you've got Father, Son, and Spirit. And 4, which represents what? Earth, like the 4 winds, the 4 corners, the 4 cardinal directions. And so that doesn't mean that the scroll has 3 divine things and 4 earthly things, but 7 is the perfect number because it contains everything. It contains everything, divine and earthly. And we noted last week, up to chapter 4, we were looking at things that concern primarily what's happening on the earth. Then in chapters 4 and 5, we looked at things happening in heaven, and now heaven is about to affect earth. Well, that's an interesting concept. What happens in heaven affects what happens on earth. Have you ever thought about that? Revelation would encourage us to remember that. All right. So we're looking at these 7 seals, and I'll give you the outline here, and then we'll walk through these portions together. There is a division in the 7 seals. The first 4 seals are of the same grouping, and the last 3 seals are not necessarily of the same grouping, but we'll see how they're possibly a little bit connected. But the first 4 are definitely connected together, and that's the 4 horses and horsemen. So we're going to look at those. I don't remember when I did, but there is a sermon on our YouTube page that deals with the 4 horsemen. All right, so the first horse is described there in verses 1 and 2 as a white horse with a rider, and the rider has a bow and arrow. And so this is interpreted various ways. Now, what does the color white often represent in the book of Revelation? Do you know? Purity and victory. So some people say, well, you got white, which is often associated with the people of God in the book of Revelation, and this is a white horse with a rider, and they say, well, this must be, hint, it's on the screen, Jesus. Okay, it must be Jesus. But there are a couple of things that might lead us away from that conclusion. One of them is the fact that when Jesus appears in Scripture, whether it's in Revelation or elsewhere, if he has any weaponry, even if it's figurative, it's usually what? A sword. Even earlier it talks about the sword of his mouth in that description that we had in Revelation 1 that goes back to Daniel. You have a question or comment, Alan?
Additionally, Jesus is the one opening the seals.
Yeah.
So I don't see that he can open the seal that contains himself.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, that's possible. So it depends on, you do have to remember the nature of the literature, that it is an image, it is a figure. So it doesn't have to make sense in that way, but I see where you're coming from. Alan says, well, if Jesus is opening the seals, he's going to open a seal, and then he's going to be the one coming out. It kind of doesn't make sense. All right. So there is a pretty strong reason to believe that this image is drawn at least on the image of the Parthians. You remember what we just said a few moments ago, that Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world at his time, and then the Romans came and basically just built on what he had done. But the Parthians were one of the thorns in the side of the Romans. They were geographically close to the Romans, but the Romans could not overcome them. I don't know if you've ever, I'm not a great student of world history, but they had similar issues trying to take portions of Great Britain. The clans and tribes that lived in Great Britain were they just weren't going to have it happen. They were going to die before they were subjugated. Parthians, very similar. Parthians, great warriors, and guess what they were known for using? Bow and arrow. So at the very least, this image is probably built on them. And considering the context in which this letter or this book is received, people living in the Roman Empire, and the Parthians being a representation of not being under the power of the Roman Empire, would be a very compelling image for the original audience, don't you think? People who are being persecuted by the Romans, knowing that there are people who exist who have not been overwhelmed or overcome or subjugated by the Romans. So it's a very powerful image for them. The second horse and rider, red, the color of blood, represents probably bloodshed and persecution. Now what you're going to see is there is a progression in this. So you've got warfare, and then you've got bloodshed, and then you have scarcity, and then you have death. So red horse and rider, representative of bloodshed, possibly including persecution. We have already seen in Revelation that Christians are dying for their faith. Then the black horse and rider are representative of drought and famine. Scarcity. What does scarcity mean? Lack of resources, right? Okay, and possibly also, as we get later in the book, economic inequality. What you see is that in some of the imagery that we're going to find in the book, there's a strong idea that Rome takes advantage of other people, and they make themselves rich. And Rome, I don't mean the empire, I mean the city of Rome. Rome takes advantage of other people. So you've got a whole empire existing primarily to enrich a few people at the center of it. And I don't mean geographic center, I mean the power center. Okay. All right. And then the pale horse and rider. Pale is the way it's translated in the ESV. Students of Greek will say it means something like yellow-green. It's the color of things we don't like. You know, when you're nauseated and your face turns green, it's kind of like that. Okay. And in this case, representative of death. So then you say, well, what's the context of this? And what's the timing? You know, when did these horsemen appear on these horses? Let's hold off on that. We're going to have to be okay in the study of this book with not answering all of our questions until we've seen the whole vision. Okay? But John's going to receive a series of visions, and instead of trying to pinpoint all the details now, let's look for the things that are clearest, and let's allow the entire book to speak before we start trying to draw hard conclusions on everything. Henry?
Who sees all of it?
John. John sees all of this.
John in the vision.
John sees it all, yes, in a vision.
There's
Remember,
nobody else around that sees.
no, he records it. He records it in the book so that others can know what he saw. Okay? Good question. Let's keep going. There's no way we're going to cover everything, but I'd rather go through it all and then go back and hit details if we miss them than to get bogged down. All right, so the last three seals appear. And again, we're not reading all of this because I'm hoping you're able to read ahead of time, but also it would take the whole class just to read it out loud. All right, so the last three seals, the souls under the altar, chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. I do want to read these cross-references because there do seem to be similar references in the book to individuals who are suffering or persecuted and remain faithful. So I'll take volunteers to read Revelation 13:15. Somebody raise your hand. Robbie's going to read Revelation 13:15. He'll take 18:24. Revelation 18. Frank's got 18:24. He'll take 20 verse 4. Alan. All right, so Robbie's got Revelation 13:15. Then Frank 18:24. And then Alan 20 verse 4. All right, when you're ready, Robbie.
As many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed.
Okay, so you see there at the end of it, it says, those who would not worship the image of the beast, we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 13, we're going to be killed. Well, what do you have in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11? You have people who have been killed for their faith. Okay, so this is a common image that occurs in the book. All right, 18:24.
And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on earth.
All right. So in her being, you have to go back up, the great city, verse 16. But it says, in this city was found the blood of the prophets and the saints. All right. So blood meaning they've been slaughtered. Okay. All right. And then 20 verse 4.
Then I saw thrones and seated on them were those whose authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God. And those who had not worshipped the beast and its image had been received its mark on the forehead of their hand
So Revelation 20, verse 4, everybody focuses on the 1,000 years. A huge interpretive discussion there. But in this moment, we're thinking about the fact that there are individuals who were beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the Word of God. So we have this image back in chapter 6 of these souls under the altar. They have been slain out of faithfulness to God, and they're under the altar. Remember what we said last week when we were looking at chapters 4 and 5? That the description of the throne room of heaven is reminiscent of the temple of God. And so here it says these souls are under the altar. All right. The next seal, earthquake, a moon looks like blood, and stars falling from the sky, all of these things. Okay. Now this is language that we've seen before. And this is where we have to get really careful. If you hear that stars are falling from the sky and the moon is turning blood red and the earth is shaking, what does that sound like to you? The end of time. Well, we know that there is an end coming, right? The earth will be destroyed. God will render judgment. He'll make all things new. Some of that comes from the last portion of Revelation. But this is not just physical language, because we can look at other examples. If you go back to Isaiah and Ezekiel in particular, and we said when we started this study, one of the reasons we have so much trouble with the book of Revelation is it's chock full of stuff that comes from the Old Testament, and we don't know our Old Testament as well as we should. This is the language of political upheaval. That is, when people in power are overthrown, it is described in this way in the Bible. So we're going to withhold judgment right now on whether this seal is representative of things happening physically on the earth or whether it's representative of political structures being overthrown. Now, I say we're going to withhold judgment because with the information we have right now as readers, we may not know which one it is. So let's wait and see what else we can learn before we pass that judgment. But understand that the Bible uses this very kind of language to describe political powers being overthrown. Okay? Even in Matthew 24, which I believe is about the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, what you have now is an interlude. Chapter 7, the entirety of chapter 7 is an interlude. What is an interlude? It is a break. So we have 7 seals, then we have 7 trumpets, and then we have 7 bowls of incense. And in this case, between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, there is a break. And this is so important. When the book of Revelation answers its own questions, we need to pay close attention, okay? So in chapter 6 and verse 17, during this 6th seal, a question is asked. The question is, the great day of wrath has come, and who can stand? It's not stated directly, but is who can stand on that day? And the answer is found in chapter 7. Who will be able to stand on the day when wrath comes? And what is the answer that's given in chapter 7? I ask you guys who are able to read. I haven't asked anybody to raise your hands. I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot. But if you read chapter 7 and you think you know the answer to the question, who can stand on the day when wrath comes, according to chapter 7?
Those who are in Christ.
The people of God. Actually, not just those in Christ. Okay? So we have it's a two-part division. If your Bible has headings in it similar to mine, verses 1 through 8 are together, and then at verse 9 there is a new header. Okay? Now the reason I bring that up is when you look at verses 1 through 8, you find this 144,000, 12,000 from the tribe of Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay? Say that 10 times fast. Or 12, as it may be. All right, 12,000 from each tribe. Now we talked about numbers last week. What do we say the number 12 is representative of? Anybody remember? Really important. Also really easy if you think about other times when you see the number 12 in the Bible. So do that. Just tell me. And when do you see the number 12 in the Bible? 12 tribes. 12 apostles. And the, sir? Yeah, 3 times 4. All right, so 12 tribes came from 12 sons, didn't they? All right, so you've got 12 being a significant number in the Old Testament. Here we have 12 tribes listed. Now, we don't have time to discuss why the particular names are chosen because there are a few different ways that the 12 tribes are listed. In this case, Joseph is one tribe. Well, when you read the Old Testament, off of them, it's Ephraim and Manasseh. And then if you look at, anyway, we're not going to go into all that today. Why is Manasseh listed and the tribe of Joseph? That means somebody else was left out. Dan, right? So why is Dan left out? I don't know, okay? Maybe we could read too much into that. In any case, 1,000 is the largest numerical unit. Now you say, well, it says 12,000 here. It says 12 by 1,000. Okay? It's the largest numerical unit in common vernacular at the time that this is written. So 12,000 means 12 times 1,000, the full number. The full number of each of these tribes is brought in. So if we think for a moment, the full number of the 12 tribes of Israel are delivered from the judgment that is coming. What do we know from the New Testament about the children of Israel in terms of salvation? Did the Jews believe in Jesus? No. By and large, they did not. But Paul talks about how he would give up himself in Romans chapter 9. He would give up his own salvation if they would be saved. But there's also this thought in the book of Romans in particular that at a certain point, the full number of Israel will be saved. And people take that differently, and that often depends on how they read this book. But this is saying the complete number, the full number of the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, will be saved. Now, we know that this is specific to the children of Israel. It's not just a spiritual identification of Israel, because when we get to chapter 9, we learn that there's an unnumbered multitude from every nation. Well, why make the point from every nation if up here in verses 5 through 8 is representative of Gentiles who have been grafted into Israel? You see what I'm saying? There is a distinction being made between those who are descendants of Abraham and those who are from every nation. So the full number of those who are to be saved from the descendants of Abraham will be saved. The number is not literal. There are religious groups out there that say only 144,000 people will be in heaven. I don't know what they do with verse 9, since it says there's a great multitude that no one can number from all the nations. The number in heaven, unknown to us. God, I'm sure, knows. We don't know, right? But it's more than 144,000, all right? In any case, that's why I put that on the screen. Verse 14, often debated, 144,000, is not a literal number. It is representative of the fullness of the nation of Israel that are saved. Not all of Israel being saved, but all those from Israel who are saved. All right? And then we're going to look here at this last seal. So that's the interlude, chapter 7. We skipped a bunch of stuff. Verse 17 is a favorite. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Does that mean? Well, we're not going to talk about timing today. I don't want to go down too many rabbit trails. All right, the last seal is in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Seventh seal is open. There's silence in heaven for about half an hour. People disagree what that silence represents. Again, we don't have to understand all of that to get the big picture. But he says, I saw 7 angels who stand before God and 7 trumpets. That's foreshadowing of the next set of 7 that starts in verse 6. And then there's this golden censer. What's a censer? Yeah, it's a thing you put incense in it. The incense is ignited in a way, and you hold that censer in the Old Testament in the temple. It was on a metal rod, so it almost looked like I don't know if you've ever seen one of those bed warmers that people used. They put coals in it and they put it under the sheets to warm up the bed. It almost looked like that. But then in the modern day, you'll see, if you've ever visited, I went to a funeral one time in a Catholic church. It was a full mass. So the priest is walking up and down with incense inside this metal container on a gilded rope, and there's smoke coming out of it. Okay, so a representative here we see of the prayers of the saints. That the incense that is inside this golden censer is representative of the prayers of those who are holy, those people who belong to God. And so the final seal is, in a way, at first, seemingly more peaceful than the first 6 that we saw, until we get to the end of verse 5. The angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar. And remember, what's under the altar in this vision? The souls of saints who were beheaded, right? So he took the angel, or I don't know if it said beheaded, they were slain. Later it says they were beheaded, all right. He took the fire from the altar, filled it in the censer, threw it on the earth. And what happened when he threw it on the earth? There were peals of thunder. This is Revelation 8, verse 5. Peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now, if you read that, just keep your finger in Revelation and go over to Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, Moses, I think it should say 19. I think I typed the wrong thing. Let's check it. Yes, it should say 19. I got ahead of myself when I was making the slides. All right, so it's Exodus 19. In chapter 20, Moses is on Mount Sinai and he receives the 10 Commandments. Before he receives the 10 Commandments, we get this description in Exodus 19, beginning in verse 16. Children of Israel are at the base of Mount Sinai. All right, and this is what it says. On the morning of the 3rd day, there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly, which would be what? An earthquake. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Now go back to Revelation 8, verse 5. There were what? Peals of thunder, rumblings, which some translations say voices or sounds. Maybe it's similar to the trumpet blast in Exodus 19. Flashes of lightning and an earthquake. So what is this language describing in Exodus 19? The overwhelming presence of God. In Revelation 8, verse 5, the prayers of the saints are being sent down to earth, and the result of that is all these things. What's maybe accompanying their prayers?
The presence of the Lord.
The presence of God. What do you think? So what do we know? What do we know? Well, we kind of maybe got a little bit of an understanding of the 7 seals. We don't understand everything around them. We still don't know when they're going to happen. This point in reading the book, we still don't understand everything about them, but maybe we've begun to understand more about them than we did when we read it the first time. Now, we've got about 4 minutes left. I want to answer any questions you have, if I'm able, or discuss anything you'd like to discuss from your reading.
I have a question that's kind of off the topic.
Okay.
You may have, I think you briefly touched on this at the beginning of the lesson, but do we know roughly when this was written?
Okay, so Alan asked, when was the book of Revelation written? We don't know from an archaeological standpoint when it was written. Okay, so we have manuscripts of the New Testament from very early, but we have very few that come from before 150 AD. Okay, so that means when we start trying to understand when a book like Revelation is written, we're having to rely on what's said in the book. And since what's said in the book is so highly debated, there are 2 prevailing views on when the book was written. One prevailing view says the book of Revelation was written before AD 70. And this view says that a lot of what's written in it has to do with judgment of the nation of Israel in the form of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. They also those who argue this also talk about the way that the author speaks and writes versus the way that John speaks and writes in his other material. And they say that when you start talking about the time periods when others of his books were written, how has his language changed or not changed and all that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that discussion. The other prevailing view is that it was written in the early 90s and that it is primarily about the destruction of Rome. Okay, not destruction of Rome in the way that Jerusalem was destroyed, but it's about judgment on Rome, the city of Rome, not the empire. And so when you start talking about all of these various interpretive things, what does it refer to? And then those other interpretive views. So you can take the view that most of what's in the book of Revelation is about the future and say, well, it didn't really matter so much when it was written because it's all about the future anyway. But if you start saying that it's about things happening in the immediate context, then it becomes much more important that you identify when it was written. Does that make sense? So I tend to take the later view that was written in the early 90s. That makes the most sense to me based on everything I've seen. But I also, because I don't believe that it's about Jerusalem, I think that there are elements of the book that are certainly Jewish. A lot of elements of the book are Jewish. But I don't believe that the images that are identifiable when we start talking about power structures and destruction and all of that make the most sense to be identified as Jewish individuals. In particular, how much power did Jewish individuals even have? And why would that have been very relevant to Christians in Asia Minor? It would have mattered to them if people in Rome were suffering, since Rome is the hub of the source of their persecution. So to me, it makes a lot more sense that it was written in the 90s, but I think that discussion gets above us pretty quickly. Frank?
I think learning from me, now maybe I've got this wrong, but I think of the 7 seals, the first 4 are earthly oriented, and the last 3 are heavenly oriented. Makes sense in that we broke that down into the...
Well, I do... I do think that the first 4 are definitely earthly oriented, and the last one, the 7th one, proceeds from heaven to earth. You start talking about the other 2, souls under the altar, obviously in heaven. This earthquake moon stuff, though, sounds like something happening on earth. But I would say this, if power structures are changed on earth, is that relative to anything happening in heaven? If people in power are brought down from power on earth, does that relate to anything happening in heaven? Well, we know, according to Scripture, that people on earth are in power because who puts them there? So there is a connection. There is a connection. Okay? Other questions or comments? All righty. Well, next week, I've got the reading schedule here. Next week, I thought I had it. We'll be covering chapters 10 and 11. I'm sorry. Chapter 8, verse 6 through chapter 9, verse 21. Chapter 8, verse 6 through chapter 9, verse 21. We do have coffee and donuts in the fellowship hall downstairs if you'd like to go down and enjoy that time together, and we'll be back here for worship at 11. Thank you all for your participation.